What's up, everyone? As you may know or may have guessed, I am Jay, and in this video I am going to be talking about how to pick out water cooling components for your PC. Now, fair warning, this is going to be the first part in kind of my water cooling series. Honestly, it might just be 2 videos. I think this video I'm going to go over how to pick components and whatnot, and the next video will be me actually putting the loop together and everything, and then my final thoughts on stuff after that. For this video, it might be a little boring. It's going to be a little long. I just actually finished recording it, and it was about 45 minutes. I'm going to try to pare that down a little bit. I'm sure I'll be able to shave off at least 5 or 10 minutes in editing. But it is going to be a little bit of a lengthy video, but it'll be some good information. And if you're really serious about water cooling your PC, I would say just try to sit through it and to listen to everything that I have to say, because I feel like at least I feel like I gave some good information, and everything on how to pick out all the parts for a water cooling loop and put them together. But yeah, so let's get into it. All right, so starting out water cooling, the first thing you need to do is look at your case and figure out where the water cooling components are going to be placed and kind of your size tolerances. So in a general water cooling loop, you have 4 main components. The first one is your CPU water block, and optionally a GPU water block. The second one is going to be your reservoir, the third, the radiator, and finally a pump. So these are the 4 main big components that you need to consider the placements of. Now, the water blocks are kind of going to be placed where they're going to be placed, right? Because, so like, let's say this is your case and your motherboard is here, the CPU is generally always going to be in this general area, so that's where your CPU water block is going to be. Same with the GPU, your graphics card's always going to be right about here, so that's where your GPU water block is going to be. That's where the placement of it is. That's kind of the end of that. But the pump, the reservoir, and the radiator are the main 3 components that you need to look at. And not only do you need to think about the placements, but you need to think about the sizes of them. So the first thing we can do is look at radiators. And generally, every computer case that is made for water cooling, the manufacturer will have a spec sheet on it that suggests potential radiator sizes and just general radiator support. So in my case, the Master Case 5 Pro, or Pro 5, whatever it is, you can see here that at the front, we have support for a 240 or 200 millimeter radiator up to 40 millimeters thick. And this is the dimension without fans, because you do need to consider the space that fans will take up. Now, okay, we'll keep going. So at the top, it can fit a 240 millimeter up to 40 millimeters thick. And I mean, if we really wanted to, we could fit like a single 120 and maybe a single 140. We'd have to check the measurements though. And finally, at the rear, we can fit a 120 or 140 millimeter radiator. So you kind of get a general starting point for these things, but really you want to look at, I mean, even the 140, there are plenty of 140 millimeter radiators that will not fit at the back of this case. So this is really something that you kind of use as a starting point, and then you really need to take your own measurements and find out what will fit. So the next thing that I did that you should do is kind of decide the general placements of things that you're going to have. So you're going to have a pump, a reservoir, and radiators. So generally, you know, here's my my motherboard, my CPU, my GPU. So this space right here is where the reservoir can go. There's also I could kind of like lay it down at the front if I wanted to, and maybe I don't know, towards the front here. If I wanted to leave the radiator off here, I could maybe mount a reservoir up top here. So you kind of look at these different places, and I think if I want maybe like a really small reservoir, I could fit one right here. But you kind of look at these placements and where things could go, and generally this spot right here is where your standard tube radiator will go. There's another, you can also get a, so like right now this shows the the optical drive cage is removed and placed for a fan, but there is an optical drive cage here in many cases, obviously there is, and you could put they do make reservoirs that are the shape of an optical drive, so you could fit that in here as well. So these are all things that you need to consider, kind of the general size and shape of the reservoir that you want, and then the general position. So I'm going to put mine here, and then we need to think about, so then we need to look at, once you figure out where you want your reservoir to go, you need to look at the measurements, like the spaces, how much space do you have to fit this reservoir in. So your standard tube reservoir is 60 millimeters thick, which I believe there's like 80 or 100 here, so that's plenty of space. And then, and this space here is, I think, 300 millimeters tall. So I could fit a 250 millimeter reservoir in here. Same with like if you wanted to put the reservoir down here or up here, you need to, kind of get your measurements and figure out how much space you have to fit everything in. And then you do the same with your radiators. So this case comes with this radiator cage here. So I put my 240 millimeter radiator up top here, and I actually ended up doing a 140 in the back. And I figure when I do my GPU, I'll eventually put a 360 in the front. And this is another thing that, if you noticed, the case mentioned that it only has enough room for a 280. And that 280 will fit above here. Like this space will fit a 280, but there's an opening right here. You can barely see it, but there's this cutout, and that's where the 40 millimeters is. So you could potentially fit a 360 millimeter radiator up here. So that's the 3x120. You could not, however, fit a 420 millimeter radiator, which is the 3x140. Although you can fit 3 140 millimeter fans. So it's kind of funny because I'll get to that in a minute. So once you kind of get the general measurements of your case, then you can move on to actually picking out your components. So the first thing we want to look at is a CPU water block. You can really, if you want to go for the cheapest, go for the cheapest. But if you're looking at kind of like how much to spend, like, well, I could get this one for 45, but then there's this other one that's slightly more. Generally, obviously you don't need to spend $200 on a water block, but if you're looking at trying to see where the one that I bought, I wonder if it's on here, because that has a good example. Yeah, so here's the Heat Killer 4 basic model, and the Heat Killer 4 Pro model. Now the Pro model is less than $10 more, but the basic is essentially just an inlet, a plate, and an outlet. The Pro model actually has like little fins and a lot more routing and stuff for the water to go through and more surface area, so you're going to achieve maybe a few extra degrees of cooling with the Pro model. So for less than $10 more, if you can swing it, I would go with the slightly more expensive. Like get as much as you can, because the more you spend, the more cooling you're going to get out of it, within reason. Obviously, sure, you'll probably get pretty good cooling out of this $240 water block, but it's the whole diminishing returns thing. You don't need to spend that much. Okay, so next I'll mention the GPU water blocks. If you are getting a GPU water block, you need to get one that is made for your graphics card. And we can see here I'm using the 1080 As an example, there are a bunch of 1080 water blocks. These are all for the Founders Edition or the reference PCB. Now, you'll have to look at the spec sheets of the company that creates the water block, so you can see which cards they fit, because generally, like, EK will mention all of the graphics cards that they fit. So if you look at the EK's reference, I don't know, where is it? If you look at EK's reference water block, and then you look at the spec sheet for it, it'll list all of the 1080s that have that reference PCB design. So you can see, you know, which graphics cards are covered under there. If you're going for a graphics card that has a non-reference design, you can see here that there's the MSI, their gaming X, and the regular gaming one, the card with the red, the dual fan red cooler. I think all those cards pretty much fall into this water block. There's the Asus ROG Strix. Then there's just regular Strix, I guess, unless this is the same thing in just a different category. And then you have the reference, and then you have another MSI, and I believe this is the I forget which one this is, but it's another one of MSI's. And then you have the Gigabyte G1, and there's a couple of Gigabytes cards that have this PCB, and they're just like, you know, the different performance models that have the same PCB. So you really need to do your research and figure out, especially if you're getting a graphics card that has a custom PCB, like one of the board cards with a custom PCB, there's a chance that it might not have a water block for it. So you really, before you're getting your graphics card, you need to look. If you know that you want to water cool your graphics card, you need to look and make sure that that card has an available water block. So next up, radiators. Like I was talking about, there are there's a slew of different sizes, and within each size, so the sizes correspond to the size fans that fit it. So there's a 120 and a 140 for your base, and then the 240 is two 120s, and a 280 is two 140s, and then the 360 is three 120s, and the 420 is three 140s, and that is the measurement of the fin area. The area that fits the fans. So like that's the measurement of the area that fits the fans. But then you also have these little, like a little bit of space on the edges and especially on the ends. And depending on the design, like these cards or these radiators that, let's click on this so we can get it a little bit bigger. Depending on the design, we can see like the way that this is shaped, this radiator is going to be a little bit longer than some other. I don't know if this is a 280. Yeah, so this one's going to be a little bit longer than a standard 280. So depending on the design and depending on the manufacturer, all of these radiators, even though like every radiator that's 280 millimeters is not going to have the same footprint. So you really need to get the measurements and make sure that that specific radiator will fit inside of your case where you want to place it. So the next thing is with the radiator designs, you have these kind of, so there's two different designs. One is like this, and these are fairly new, I think, where there's an inlet at one side and an outlet at the other. And this would be good for, like, let's say you have this, I don't know, I guess if you could have it at the top or at the front, but in my case, like if I had a 360 like this at the front that spanned the whole thing and it actually went down into the basement, I could have an inlet at the top, and then I could have it go all the way down, or actually I guess the inlet would be at the bottom. So I could have the pump at the basement go straight into the bottom port here and then go up to the top of it. And these have a design where the water flows, so like you have the entire width of the thing, and the water just like fills in and flows all the way across the entire thing. Whereas if you have one of these, so we gotta wait for it to reload. If you have one of these other, let's see, let's click on this one. If you have one of these other designs where the ports are both at one end, the way that these work is it has the, so like there's a port here and a port here, and half of it will, like, you know, the inlet port, half of it will flow down, and then it'll go across the bottom channel, and then it'll flow back up and out the other port. So like half of it's going this direction, half of it's going this direction. So there's a little bit more pressure needed to pump the water all the way through that, as opposed to the radiator with a port on either side. The water just needs to flow through in one direction. So that's something else to keep in mind when picking your radiator. So not only, so like I mentioned before with my case is supposed to be able to fit a 140 at the back, but really there were a lot of 140 millimeter radiators that didn't fit. I think there were only maybe two that I was able to find that fit, and one of them that only actually fit fairly well. And even then, it doesn't fit perfectly. It's kind of held in there a little funny. I mean, it works, but it's not a perfect fit. So, and finally with radiators, the thing that you need the other dimension. So not only do you need to figure out the footprint of it, how that fits, but you need to figure out the thickness and how much space you have to work with. So like mine said, up to everything's up to 40 millimeters. So at the top, the motherboard, until it hits the top of the case, has 40 millimeters. And the same with the front. There's a little opening at the bottom that's 40 millimeters wide. So if I'm fitting a radiator through that opening, it can only be 40 millimeters wide. Of course, there is the option of modifying your case. And also with the top, mine has a cage that holds extra space for the fans or the radiator, depending on what you're putting in there. But another thing that you need to think about is not only the thickness clearance for the radiator, but also adding an extra 25 millimeters for the fans to attach to the radiator as well. All right, so next up, this is where it gets fun. This is where it gets a little confusing, and this is where you really need to explore all of your options. Is with the reservoirs and the pumps. So I guess to start out with, a reservoir is technically not entirely necessary. It's technically an optional component. It's not required to, because obviously, so you have to have the pump to circulate the fluid, the water, you have to have the water block to cool the component, and then you have to have the radiator to exhaust the heat. But the reservoir technically isn't necessary. It does, however, make it very easy. Makes it so much simpler to fill up the loop. And if you're not really experienced with doing this, I would highly recommend getting a reservoir. So next up, so you need to look at the size of the reservoir that you can fit inside of your case, and you kind of need to look at the mounting brackets and kind of the places that you can mount a reservoir inside of your case. You might end up having to drill some holes or something. So these are all things that you just need to look at and really do some reading, do your research, figure things out. So there are a bunch of different kinds of reservoirs. Like I mentioned, you can get ones that fit that are made to fit inside the drive bays, and they kind of show you like the water level and stuff. And I don't know if they might be a little easier to fill up. They're generally a little less expensive, I think, because you can just slap a pump on the back of it and it's like an all-in-one unit. But generally people like to use the tube reservoirs because they look nice and they're fun to show off and everything. And now but they have a bunch of different kinds, and essentially it just needs to be able to hold the water, and it needs to have some ports. So so there needs to be, say, at least three ports in your reservoir. There needs to be one at the top so that you can fill the loop for adding liquid to the loop. And then there can be an optional second one at the top or at the bottom, depending on the reservoir configuration. But there needs to be one for the loop, for the input. The input of the loop, and then there needs to be one for the output of the loop to go into the pump. And the output always needs to go into the pump. So when you're looking at reservoirs, again, you can see, for instance, this reservoir just has some end caps and a bunch of ports. So we have probably like one port here at the top for filling, and then 3 ports at the bottom. And actually, it looks like one of those is probably for an LED, and then 2 ports at the bottom. And then you have other, did I go back too far? No. Okay, and then you have other, so you have just a standard tube with ports, and then you have these other reservoirs that have blocks at the bottom, and these blocks are made to be mounted to pumps. So there's 2 options there. So you can either have, fitting and tubing going to your pump, or you can have your kind of reservoir and pump all in one unit. So I think that's pretty much it for reservoirs. So then when we look at pumps, we can see you have, so if we were just to get the reservoir pump combo type thing, you could just buy, say, like a D5 separately and hook it up to your pump or to your reservoir, and that's essentially how it would work. And then you have other, this looks like a DDC, or these are tops or something. Here's a DDC, and then here are D5s. These are the 2 kind of pumps that, like, really, I mean, they're a little bit more expensive, but if you go with the DDC or D5, you're not gonna have any problems. Like, it's just gonna work. The D5s tend to be a little bit more quiet, but they don't have as much head pressure, so they can't pump through quite as many components. But really, if you're just doing a 1 or 2 radiators and a CPU and maybe a GPU water block, so you're not doing multiple GPUs, you're not going through like multiple 300 or 400 millimeter radiators, then a single D5 or DDC should be fine. They are all, so with these pumps, they are all made by the same companies, so they're kind of branded differently for the different brands, so I think they're all manufactured by the same companies, but they're all branded differently, depending on who's selling it. But essentially, they're all the same. So pretty much go with the least expensive one that you can. You could also do the PWM. Some of them are PWM controlled, some of them are not. I don't really think you need the PWM control the pump. You really just want it to pump water through as quickly as it can, as quietly as you want it to. So if you're going with a standalone pump, the next thing you need to do is actually look at where you want to put the pump, and then look at the size of the pump. So let's see if this says how big this thing is. So here we can see the dimensions, and the dimensions can be very tricky, because this is kind of like, I think this is just the dimensions of the block. Like, this isn't even necessarily the dimensions of the entire thing. This entire thing is like 150 millimeters tall, which is pretty big. Like, D5 pumps are big. They're going to take up a lot of space. You need to make sure that you have a lot of space for them. Since I'm doing the Master Case 5 Pro, I have a kind of a small basement. I think I have maybe 150 millimeters at the basement. So I couldn't fit, like, I mean, I really couldn't fit a pump that size in there. So what I did was I went with one of these smaller DDC pumps, because the DDCs, they're a little bit noisier, but they are smaller. But they do come with some like noise dampening feet, and I was able to put in a couple little other rubber pieces and got it pretty quiet, because at first it was buzzing quite a bit. But so that's something you really need to keep in mind. Like, these it looks like it's probably this little small thing. These EK D5 pumps look really sweet, but they are they're quite big. So, make sure you have enough space. So like, if I were gonna do this, like I went with a 250 millimeter reservoir. If I were gonna use this pump, I probably would have just wanted like 100 millimeter reservoir, maybe. So that's another thing to definitely keep in mind. And one more thing with the reservoirs, the measurement of the reservoir, at least with the, I got a Monsoon modular reservoir system thing. The measurement of the reservoir, the 100, 150, 200, 250 millimeters, that is a measurement of the tube. Okay, so the end caps will add a little bit more to the entire length of the thing. So my 250 millimeter reservoir overall is like 280 millimeters. Like it's a good size. So that's something to keep in mind when you're doing your measurements, to keep in mind with your clearances and everything. Finally, one thing that I guess I'll mention here is with the fittings when you're picking out your pump and reservoir combo. If you can get both of them, if you get both of them together, that's 2 less fittings you need. So while the combo might be a little bit more expensive, keep in mind that by going with the combo, you're saving $10-15 on fittings. And we'll go over that more in a minute. My battery's dying, so this video might cut out. Okay, next up we have our fittings. So if you're going with soft tubing, it's really easy. You just buy these compression fittings. You only need things like this, where it's just a straight compression fitting. You want to match the inner diameter with the inner diameter of your soft tubing, and in the outer, like you want to match the inner diameter and outer diameter tolerances of the fitting with the inner diameter and outer diameter of your tubing, and then you just get two fittings per component and put it together. But really, I did hardline tubing, so this is going to be more of a hardline tubing guide. So the hardline tubing fittings, there are a bunch of different companies that make them. The important thing is getting the outer diameter of the size that you want. Also, just make sure that everything is a G1/4 thread. Unless you're ordering from some obscure website, I'm pretty sure the G1/4 has become kind of a standard. And if you're buying stuff from a reputable site, from the big name companies, you're not just like skimping and going with the cheapest stuff you can buy. Everything's going to be G1/4. It's all going to be compatible, so you don't need to worry about that. But essentially, also don't go with the cheapest fittings you can get. Like, this is one area where you really don't want to skimp because you don't want these things leaking. Go with a good quality brand. EK, Alpha Cool, obviously Bits Power. These are all really high-end brands. Monsoon, I got mine are Monsoon Fittings, and I'll actually go over a little thing with that real quick in a minute. But essentially, you want to get 2 fittings per component. So this is where I said before, if you have the reservoir pump combo, then you don't need tubing to go between those, so you can cut out 2 fittings. But generally 2 fittings per component. So if you just have a CPU water block, so you have CPU water block, radiator, pump, reservoir, it's 8 fittings. If you add another radiator, that's 10 fittings. If you add a GPU, that's 12 fittings. So that's where you need to keep that in mind. And then another thing that, let me click on this real quick. One thing in a video that I watched that was recommended, and I actually found this to be a very good recommendation. Let's see if we can find these barb extensions. Is there like a rigid selection here? I don't know. But another thing that I found was it suggested just buying 3 or 4 90-degree angles. And the reason you want to do this is because A, you can fit things in tighter spaces, and B, it makes you have to deal with less bends. Like, it makes it easier, and it's really not a bad idea. So I would honestly, it's a good idea to spend a little extra money, buy a few extra fittings, get some 90-degree fittings. You want to get rotary fittings, because that way you can adjust, once you've tightened them down, then you can adjust the angle at which they're, the position at which they're facing. I would also get something like these, I think this is for a soft tubing. So you don't really need these things for soft tubing, but if you're doing hardline tubing, get one of these like dual dual rotary. Okay, actually this one's a triple rotary, but get a dual, at least one, if not two, dual rotary 90-degree fittings, because those will allow you to get some like crazy bends and like squiggly things. So you can get a good. They just allow you to get some odd angles that you might face. And I actually have one, and I've used it, and it really came in handy. It made me just have to use like a little slightly bent link of tubing for one of my bends, and it really saved me there. Another thing that I would recommend doing is picking up, or at least looking at how you think your things are going to fit, and picking up maybe like a small, like 3 or 5 millimeter spacer, and then like an 8 millimeter spacer. Because you never know where you might need to get a little distance, especially if you're, this is another thing that I actually forgot to mention in my last video, was with your radiators. Alright, so my camera battery just died, so if things are a little positioned differently, that's why. So another thing that I forgot to mention with the radiator is when you look at the thickness of your radiator. So if you have your fans below the radiator, so you have your ports coming out the bottom, if you're doing any 90-degree bends in front of that or anything, you need to look at the spacing of the fan. So essentially, you could have your port, especially if you do like a 90-degree angle, that angle might not reach the bottom of the fan, so your fan might be blocking your tubing. So that's where spacers would come in handy. So, you know, if you're looking at doing that, make sure to keep that in mind as well. Okay, so I think that's about it. Okay, yeah, so let's look at the Monsoon, because I think these are the only brand. Really, I would go with I would just go with, I still got the 90-degree thing checked. Let's go with their rigid compression. Okay, so really, if I were doing this again, I would just go with standard hardline tubing fittings. But these, if you're doing anything where you're going to be like carrying your case around a lot, these Monsoon fittings are actually pretty good for that. So these are a little expensive. Let's go on to these. These are a little cheaper. I think if you buy the packs, like if you buy the packs, you buy them together, they're a little less money. But so let's look at this thing here. Okay, so this is the hardline fitting, and they have, if you actually look at this, they're like, you should watch this video before you buy it. But the information that you need to know in the video isn't until like 20 minutes in. So I don't know, and it's like a 30-minute video. So I don't know why they can't just be like, by the way, you need to know this. Like, write that out. Why is it watch this video? It's like, fuck you, performant PCs. You're stupid shit. But so these fittings have a lock collar. So what you need to do is you need to put this this piece on your onto the tubing first, and then you can see this plastic thing up here. I don't know, you can kind of see it. It's like a clear plastic. This is the lock collar, and you actually need some special UV glue to put these on, and you end up gluing the lock collar onto the end of the tubing. And then the this black cap here screws down on the threading part, and that really locks it on. So you can pull on that thing, and it's not coming off. So these things will lock your tubing on to the components. Obviously, I've heard of some people complaining about the lock collars cracking on them. Don't know what I just did. What's going on? I have heard of the people complaining about the lock collars cracking on them. I think that's probably because they just like torque the hell out of the thing. You really don't have to do that. That's another thing with all of these it's another thing with all of these water cooling components is you don't have to tighten, like generally you don't have to torque them down too much. Just make them nice and snug. Don't torque the hell out of them. You'll be fine. Okay, so that is fittings. Again, kind of look through all the fittings, find what you want, what you like best, and then find the hardline tubing that goes with it. Now, there are two types of hardline tubing, or two main types. I mean, you can get glass or metal, but those things, you can't really bend them, and they require extra fittings, so they're really expensive. So I would recommend starting with either with the plastic stuff. So you have either acrylic or PETG. Acrylic, I think, is like it's a little harder. It's a little shinier, maybe a little clearer, um, and it's easier to cut and clean up. But the PETG is easier to work with, from what I understand. I went with PETG, but the main thing when you're looking at buying your tubing, but the main thing that you need to look at when buying your tubing is you need to make sure that the outer diameter of the tubing matches the outer diameter of your fittings, and B, you want to make sure that they're on the same standard. So if you're going with metric fittings, you want to get metric tubing. If you're going with imperial fittings, you want to get imperial tubing. Excuse me. So, for example, you would think that maybe 13 millimeter would fit into a half-inch fitting. No. Or, half-inch tubing would fit into a 13 millimeter tubing, or 13 millimeter fitting. They're not going to work. There's just enough of a difference to where you'll either get like you could shave down the tubing to fit into the fitting, but then it's not going to be a nice smooth surface, and you might get some leaks, and also it might be too loose, in which case you'll also get some leaks. So you definitely want to match the like if you're getting half-inch fittings, get half-inch tubing. If you're getting 13 millimeter fittings, get 13 millimeter tubing. Another thing I would recommend is, I believe I got, so I went with Monsoon, which is American, so they do inches, so it's half-inch tubing. And then I also went with, and you can buy packs that come in 4 36-inch pieces, lengths of tubing. While 2 of those 36-inch pieces was enough for me to practice with, and then the other 2 for me to actually get like a working loop going, it wasn't very good. Like I really didn't like the way that it looked, and I ended up buying a second pack anyway just to redo all my bends to make it look the way that I wanted it to, because some of the at least one of the bends was kind of like, rather than being completely horizontal, it was angled a little bit, and you could really tell, and it didn't look that good. And some of the corners were a little overheated. So I would highly recommend buying like it's fairly cheap. It's $16 for a pack of tubing. Buy 2 packs. Like really, just buy 2 packs. Spend the little extra money. I mean, you're already spending probably $400 or $500 on a whole loop anyway. $4 or $5. Did I just say $4 or $5? You're already probably spending $400 or $500 on an entire loop anyway. Spend an extra $15. Buy another pack of tubing. You will thank yourself. Save on the shipping, because you're going to end up buying it again later. Finally, we have our water cooling fluids. So you can buy, there are tons, like, you just need to look through all the water cooling fluids, see what you like. They have, like, all the dyed ones. You can buy pre-put together things. So my loop, 250 millimeter reservoir, a 140 by 40 millimeter radiator, a 240 by 30 millimeter radiator. Pretty sure it was less than or right around 1 liter of fluid to fill all of that. So, because they generally, when you buy pre-mixed fluids, they come in a liter bottle. So you'll probably only need 1 of those. Or you can just buy concentrates. Personally, I bought the, I think it was like Primo Chill Liquid Utopia. It's just an additive, a concentrate additive, and what you want to make sure that your fluid has is an anti-corrosive and an anti-biological component. After that, you can add whatever dye or whatever you want. But generally, you get concentrates. You just buy some distilled water. It's like $1 for a gallon at the grocery store, and you can fill your loop 5 times over with that much water. So that's another thing that you should do too, that I did first time. You can use the loop to flush out, or the distilled water to flush out all of your components. But that's kind of a thing for the build video. So I won't mention that too much here. But really, all you really need is that anti-corrosive, biological additive. And finally, there are a few accessories, components, tools that you need. So the first thing is a silicone insert, and you want to get one that is matched to the inner diameter of the tubing that you bought. So for me, unfortunately, Monsoon only sells these 1 foot things, and it was a little bit of a pain to only have 1 foot to deal with when doing your bends, especially if you have some longer pieces with a bunch of bends. You know, but luckily it all worked out in the end for me. So it's nice that AlphaCool has this 100 centimeter length. So if you're going with this with a metric tubing, I would go for the longest length of silicone insert that you can. And yeah, so you definitely need one of those. And what this does is it helps when you're bending. So if you were just to bend the tube without anything in it, it would totally kink, fold in on itself, kind of like a hose without any water. And so what this does is it helps keep the tubing full so that you get a nice pretty bend. So that's necessary. Another thing is, something that I'm not going to be able to pull up on here, but something to be able to cut the tubing with. With PETG, I think if you get a good enough tubing clamp thing, PETG or soft tubing, you can use the same kind of cutting tool. Or with PETG, you can use just a pipe cutting tool where you tighten it down. It has a little wheel, and you tighten it down and run it around, and tighten it down, run it around, and it slowly cuts through the tubing. With acrylic, generally you want to use either generally you want to use a hacksaw. You want to get a guide for the acrylic and hacksaw so you get a nice straight cut. Finally, there is a Reamer. These are mostly, you can use it for PETG, but it won't completely clean up the PETG. But if you're doing acrylic, you definitely want the Reamer because it'll give you a nice beveled, smooth edge, so that you don't mess up your things, your O-rings, whatever they're called. But yeah, so you don't mess up your O-rings. You could also use just a file or something. That works too. And finally, you need a heat gun. So let's pull this up. So I honestly went with the, you don't need to spend a lot on these. I went with the cheapest one that they had, which for some reason isn't showing up here. It's showing all the other Monsoon crap, but there is a, let's see if it pulls up here. It's the Wagner. No, that's weird. It just disappeared. But there was a Monsoon heat gun. I swear it was on here, and it was $15, and that's what I bought, and it worked perfect. You do want something that has kind of a flat back, so you can just lay it down, stand it up on the table so that it blows the heat up, and then you can move the tubing over it. That makes it a lot easier, so it's not blowing straight out in front of you or anything. But yeah, but now that I've probably talked for as long as the original video was, that should do it. I think I pretty much covered everything. So next video will be the build itself, and I'm sure I'll have more to say at that time. Okay, so real quick, one of the things that I kind of forgot that I'm just going back in post and adding this clip in, when you're looking at how you're going to put together your pump and reservoir, there's one thing, at least this is the easiest place to put it. You can obviously just get a fitting, a drain plug type fitting, and put it in between a couple of your lines. But the easiest place to do this is either out of your pump or out of the reservoir. Out of the pump block if there's an extra outlet or inlet, and out of the reservoir if there's an extra outlet, is to put in an extra line and an extra fitting. You can get little little ball valve fittings. So you should pick one of those up, and that will allow you to put in a drain port. Because I can guarantee you, like, this was my first time putting together a build, and I probably drained it. Like, I used that drain port a half dozen times before it was completely done. So having a way to get all of the fluids out of your case is a must. And of course, stay tuned for the next video where I will actually show you how the drain port is implemented and how it works and everything. Alright guys, well, if you're still with me, congratulations. I'm sure you are one of very few that actually made it all the way through this video. But I do really appreciate you taking the time to watch, and I hope that I gave you some good information. I hope that you found this really useful. If you did, if you liked it, if you didn't like it, whatever, let me know in the comments. And if you have any questions, like if there's anything that was a little vague or that I didn't answer entirely well, you know, just put the comments questions, whatever, put them in the comments. Let me know, and I will try to address those. I always try to respond to my comments. So I'll be going through those and answering any questions that I get. And yeah, I guess that's pretty much it for this video. Like I said, I will be putting out another one with the actual build and everything. So stay tuned for that, and I will see you next time.